Favell has a already long and very rich career and very eclectic set of research interests. So his main domain of expertise, or at least the domain of expertise through which I got to know him, was the sociology and politics of immigration in Europe. And he's been publishing extensively on these issues. In the long, very long bibliography, in his very long bibliography, he has written about philosophies of integration, immigration and the idea of citizenship in France and Britain, and that's a book that has been really field defining, I think. When it was published in the late 1990s. He has also written about xenophobia in Europe with a book called New Xenophobia in Europe in 1995, The Human Face of Global Mobility, Internationally Highly Skilled Migration in Europe, North America and the Asia Pacific. And he has also, in connection with studies of immigration, he has thought a lot about the question of citizenship. And his forthcoming book is Untitled Immigration, Integration and Mobility, New Agendas in Migration Studies. So it's a kind of general overview and attempt at theorizing the field. But he has also interest in very different set of questions and issues. He has written about Japanese contemporary art and is still working on this issue. It's called Before and After Superflat, a short history of Japanese contemporary art 1990-2011, a book published in Hong Kong. And he has also, or he is also working on the recent history of architecture. So today he's going to keep his presentation to his main domain of research, the question of immigration. And as you know, this seminar is devoted for the entire year to the question of austerity, or rather how the crisis of 2008 and its many aftershocks have transformed policy and politics in Europe. And Adrian Favell is going to speak tonight about the impact of these new policies and politics on the question of immigration, with a talk entitled The Fourth Freedom, Free Movement and Migration in Europe Before and After the Crisis. Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Emmanuel for the invitation to speak in this distinguished series. First of all, to the Alliance that have brought me here this year, to Columbia, and of course the Lincoln European Institute for this invitation. I hope we can have a bit of a discussion at the end of this. And I hope some of the things that I say strike you as maybe as surprising and provocative, perhaps, in this context. I'm going to explain why there's a picture of pret-a-manger workers a bit later. I think you have this in New York now. This is for a long time going to feature on the London landscape. That's quite important. Now, I don't have a PowerPoint today, really. I have a few images to amuse you along the way, but nothing very systematic in terms of the PowerPoint. So this will be mainly talk. Really, there's three kinds of areas I'm going to talk about. As I lay this out. Firstly, I want to really talk a bit conceptually about the notion of freedom of movement as a form of spatial mobility. And I'm avoiding the word migration or immigration in this context to some extent, because I want us to shift from a migration perspective to a mobilities perspective on this. I think it's essential to understand what's been happening in Europe on this. As we go along, this will also lead me to question certain sorts of, I'd say, orthodox, what are now emerging as rather orthodox critical ideas about the notion of neoliberalism as a kind of apparatus for understanding kind of what's wrong with the world at the moment, and particularly what's maybe wrong with Europe at the moment. I'm a liberal, and I'm not happy at all with the use of the word neoliberalism in a lot of the discussions. And this discussion, I hope, puts its finger on one of the key problems, I think, in the perspective that we're hearing about neoliberalism. And I do this really with the fact in mind that we have Wolfgang Straight coming here in a couple of weeks, and so it's a kind of warm-up, in a sense, for some of the things that he'll be saying, but I hope, in some senses, questioning some of the things that are put on the agenda Strake's recent writings on the subject. This is not to offer an anti-critical view. I mean, what I want to try to do is emphasise what I see as the rather radical transformative potentials of some of the liberalising trends in Europe, and particularly the transformative power in some sense of the economy, of the labour market as reconceived as a movement of, as a space of free movement within the European space. And again, this kind of runs in the face of a lot of kind of typical sorts of conceptions, I think, about what's right and wrong, essentially, in these issues. Secondly, I'm going to talk a bit about Britain. Focusing on Britain is also good in this context, but there are so many cliches about Britain as a neoliberal, Anglo-Saxon deviation from the good European model, etc. I'm really kind of, again, criticising these sorts of issues by just pointing on this one particular issue where I think Britain actually has been a very interesting experiment in some sense during the 1990s and 20s, that is, 1990s and 2000s, prior to the recent crisis perhaps. That is, in the way in which migration has become such a dominant feature of the free movement within European free movement has become such a dominant feature within Europe. So there are huge things at stake for Europe in Britain's upcoming potential vote on membership of the EU. Really huge things. I think all of the good things about the EU, in many ways, could get undone by the British vote if it votes against it. And so it's not just me that's concerned about this. I'm concerned about this personally because I'm a European citizen living and working in France and Paris, and it will certainly mess up my life seriously. But there are lots of other things I think that we need to be concerned about here. And it's not, I think losing Britain would be a huge problem, a huge catastrophe probably for the EU. And thirdly, I want to engage a bit with this issue that I think Wolfgang Strake will discuss, which is the re-emergence of what he calls the Polanyi-inspired double movement reaction against neoliberalism in Europe, and the call to democracy, essentially, to save Europe. And I'll be questioning, I think, this perspective, but that'll be towards the end. There is an article attached to this talk, and it is forthcoming in European Journal of Social Theory. And I should say that there's an awful lot of provisionality in my argument. I'm quite uncomfortable about elements of this argument, and I'm wanting to share my discomfort with you in the hope that we can get some discussion on these issues. Because I think it's very difficult to formulate a critical or progressive view on migration. Always, and I think particularly on some of these issues to do with free movement, because they cut across some of our typical ways of classifying these things positively and negatively. So. Okay, so let's get into the first section of this talk. What is freedom of movement? Well, I'm talking about the freedom of movement of persons, and I'm talking about this as the fourth movement in the canonical free movement of capital, goods, services, and persons. Which, of course, are, in a sense, familiar to everybody as the main drivers of globalization, of global economic integration, the drivers of neoliberalism, as we conventionally understand it, for the last 20, 30 years, and also the canonical four foundational ideas driving the notion of European integration. European integration, of course, is a developing political project in many ways, but without the core fundamental economic integration principles about the construction of a free market based on these kinds of dimensions, there would be no European Union. I'm not going to address here, there's a fundamental theoretical problem running through this, which causes difficulties, I think, in discussions across theoretical lines, which is a distinction between the way liberals look at this and the way, as it were, radicals would look at this perspective. I mean, it's the issue of whether or not we distinguish between markets and states, and we see markets and states as a kind of in some sort of relationship where either the state's taking over the market or the market's rolling back the state, versus I think the current combination of Marxist Foucauldian or Foucauldian Marxist type views about articulating a lot of the debates on neoliberalism, which are essentially see the market and state as some kind of co-constructed, in a sense, and in the services of various power formations and so forth. This I think is an interesting theoretical debate which we can have. But what I want to say as a starting point is really that I see movement of persons across borders, which are national borders, in relation to the free movement of capital goods and services. The free movement of persons, I think, has special properties, effectively. What I'm arguing for is, and these are the human properties of migrants, of people, of moving. And this is what makes it less easy to apply some of the typical arguments about neoliberalism to the free movement of persons, even when that free movement is being driven by economic market forces. And most of what I'm talking about in Europe is being driven by economic market forces, the building of a single market within a European territorial space, which enables the free movement of workers within that space. Of course, free movement applies, as I specified, because it applies beyond the free movement of workers. But without that component, there's nothing in the sense. We have to build this up out of an account of what the breaking down of borders has done to this part of free movement. Now, this is what makes the EU special or different in the world of regional integration, or in the if you think of this in terms of Peter Kassenstein's very well-known book on comparative regional integrations internationally. The European Union is a special case in this sense because of its embrace right from the beginning of a conception of the free movement of workers as part of the package. So in other words, it's different to NAFTA. It's not just the free movement of capital goods and services across borders with heavy restrictions on the movement of workers, on labour. It is the breaking down of borders to free movement of workers along the same lines as the breaking down of capital goods and services. But this has rather different and possibly unexpected consequences for the architects of this particular conception. I know, there are other things to be said about the relationship to other regional integrations such as ASEAN or Mercosur, Latin America, ASEAN and Southeast Asia and so on. But I think the EU is rather special, and on some level, the conception of free movement of persons in the European Union construction is particularly unique, largely because of the way in which it's been inscribed in law over the decades, and so that and this is where, of course, it will be familiar to those of you that know anything about the political science or law of this kind of subject. That is that yes, it was the free movement of workers. It was initially the free movement of Italian workers to the north of Europe, northwest of Europe, creating legal jurisprudence which over time has been systematized and extended towards other categories of movers who might not come into the same kind of active economic category as workers, such as spouses, families, and so forth. It's been extended in other ways, sort of laterally, to students and retired people and other kinds of persons that are enabled to move, such that we eventually move towards a conception of European citizenship in the post-1986 Single European Act, and then eventually the Maastricht Treaty, which formulates a notion of European citizenship, although it's a long way short of what we really ought to be calling it. It's not citizenship, it's a free movement of persons linked to the free movement of economic movements within Europe. And this, such that all citizens of Europe, all citizens of European member states have this particular right. Now, the conventional view of this, of course, from political scientists and lawyers, is that, yes, it's an economic freedom, if you like, that within which we can now see an incipient kind of political or legal form kind of over the horizon. And so the continual normative debate is, yes, if only we could sort of push it a bit more towards political citizenship, if we could extend the Marshallian logic, the T.H. Marshall type logic, beyond the nation state to be inclusive of these free movers in a kind of post-national sphere, we would have a fully worked out conception of European citizenship. That is somehow implicit in the free movement idea, and this is the standard, I would say, the standard sort of progressive interpretation of where the EU has been going with this. It's sometimes attached to more elaborated sociological and political science views, which see this also as a kind of incipient path towards European identity in some sense. That is the building of a of a European polity, and perhaps beyond that a European society that's somehow linked to a notion of European citizenship, European membership that is involved in. Now, I'm going to instead argue against this. I don't think that the radical or transformative potential of the EU lies in this kind of progress towards political and legal rights. I think it actually lies in what is implied by the free movement of persons as economic actors. It's sort of flipping it round in a moment, but I'll get to this in a second. But first of all, I wanted to just show you a couple of images to how the EU pictures this. When you go looking for images on the EU data bank for your book cover or whatever, this is one of the unfortunate images that comes up. Privileged white persons walking through walls. European free movement of doctors, lawyers, and EU fonctionnaires and so forth. This is probably how the people in the Commission see it. They imagine themselves in these terms, perhaps. And it's also a predominant image that gets associated with the so-called Eurostars that I've been writing about. Because I'm writing about Eurostars, and these are not the Eurostars I have in mind, but it's quite easy to assume that when we're talking about Eurostars, we're talking about European elites, and the European elites are the only people that benefit from this kind of free movement. This, of course, there is obviously some point to this image, but it's a problematic image. I'm sure this one is equally problematic in various ways, but this is a somewhat more attractive image from the 2006 European Year of Workers' Mobility, at a kind of high point of mobility in the continent, imagining freedom of movement as a benefit really for young people on the move. And if you're wondering what's across the water, well, you recognise all the icons of the Euro cities. So it's Eurostars and Euro cities. These are, of course, more the Eurostars that I had in mind, young people that are enabled to move by European free movement. There's a hint of diversity in this picture. They're certainly young. Someone's got a tattoo, and they're kind of dreaming of something across the water. And what they're dreaming, of course, is across the water is Manhattan. It's a vision of the EU, the USA, with the Manhattan skyline in the background, except the Manhattan skyline is now a Euro skyline with the icons of Euro cities to which they will move. And both of these obviously are linked to an economic agenda. They're linked to the Lisbon Agenda of 2000, which was precisely a reformulation of the European economy about trying to get the highly skilled, the talented, the educated on the move in Europe to try and shift the sclerosis of the continent towards a more competitive global economy with people on the move as part of the international global competition for talent and the competitive economies and so forth. That's I think certainly part of what's going on here. But what I want to ask you, because what is, of course, is radical about this, what is really interesting, or either conceptually or politically, about this kind of free movement, which I will obviously describe a little bit empirically as we get to it a little way along the line here. Now, what I think the important point here is that the movements that we're talking about, the free movement of European citizens that has been extended across all of the European member states. There, of course, are barriers towards certain member states. There are certain sorts of provisions that have, in other words, prevented, for example, Romanians or Bulgarians over the years having full access to the full package of European citizenship. But bit by bit, these barriers have broken down, such that when we're talking about the freedom of movement of EU citizens, we are effectively talking about a generalised right of movement that is generalised to all European citizens that can be economically active effectively or sustain their lifestyle across a national border, and that this has been extended, beyond the initial idea that it was free movers from wanted economic migrants into specific sectors of the economy, as it started out with, say, the Italians or Portuguese, Portuguese come in later, but the Italians principally as member states initially, through to obviously the potentials for any West Europeans like Germans, French, Danes, etc. to move around as they wish, to progressively to East Europeans, to East and Central Europeans, and all the way through to potentially other categories of migrants who are all European citizens now, but are perhaps not in the most obvious economic desirable categories, such as Roma populations or homeless populations or unemployed populations and so forth, that maybe come from a poorer place to a more wealthy place within the EU. What's interesting about this, I think, is the conceptual shift that's going on. We're not talking about immigrants anymore. This is not an issue of immigration, really, legally, politically speaking. This is about cross-national mobilities within a single market space, in some sense. And therefore, we need to shift, in some sense, out of our discussion about immigration. Of course, there are immigrants in Europe, and there are other kinds of migrants coming from other kinds of places who are still outside of this picture. This picture doesn't extend beyond the borders of Europe. Well, it does extend beyond the borders of Europe, actually, but it doesn't extend all the way to the whole world, in some sense. But it has changed fundamentally the potentials of movement for categories of relatively poor or economically disfavoured migrants, at least within the European context, to be able to move absolutely freely. And what freedom of movement means is you literally can get on a plane with your rucksack and go to another country and set up shop there and eventually find work and live there. It becomes much more like, in other words, it transforms something that was a cross-national migration, an international migration that we might have thought of as an immigration, the immigration of a Pole from Poland to Britain, to a mobility, a form of mobility from Poland to Britain, which is more akin, or potentially more akin to being a tourist, or being a shopper, or being a part-time visitor, moving, in other words, across the border, but through other sorts of mobility categories that are enabled by law and enabled by states, but which we never talk about when we talk about immigration, because we're interested in immigrants, as such. I don't know. I tend to think that I often find that American audiences don't get this point. I don't think Eurostars and Eurocities made a lot of sense to Americans as a book, because it was talking about a kind of European phenomena that didn't seem to map on very well to American conceptions of migration in Europe, which is always about still immigration in Europe and the immigration of various categories of non-Europeans into and integrating into European states. And it's a bit strange in the sense that the EU is just like the US, I would want to say, on these points. That is, the EU is made up of states, which are conjoined together in a certain sort of territorial space, a kind of market space, if you like, conjoining these states, where there is an almost, and it's not the case, you don't have free movement completely in the US either, but where there is almost a freedom of mobility, a freedom of movement within the territory of the US from state to state. 40% of, the typical figure is that 40% of Americans have crossed state lines in their life, and in terms of migration, or it's 40% every year, so I think people move, not 40% every year, but 40% of course have moved across borders, and it's routine really for Americans to think about moving from state to state as part of their lifestyle. Now what I'm saying is basically that's the same thing for Europeans now, conceptually. I mean, it might not be the case empirically, but conceptually, there may be sociological reasons why this is not the world in reality in some sense, but legally, politically, this is what European freedom of movement creates. It creates the possibility of simply moving around within the US. I also think it's kind of interesting that the issue to compare this with in terms of the US is not really the standard immigration paradigm, which tends to dominate all of our conceptions and discussions of immigration, which is what happens to migrants is that they are disadvantaged, they move across borders. First of all, they have to find a way across the border, that's the border crossing, then they somehow have to cross the line from being a non-citizen to a citizen, transferring, becoming a national of the country, of the unit that they've moved into, and then there's a kind of a further process that may take several generations of assimilation or integration into a national society, and that's what we think about as typical kind of migration stories. That kind of paradigm potentially doesn't apply at all to the kinds of people I'm talking about in some sense, because we're no longer talking about immigration in some ways. We're talking about a free movement. And yet, you know, what might be a more useful heuristic for an American context is to think about, it's not that long ago since free movement within the US was highly contested as a legal and political potentiality. That is, in the 1940s, 30s and 40s, there was an awful lot of reaction against so-called migrants, which were, in fact, free movers from 4 southern states in the US to, say, the West Coast in the US, as migrants that maybe were unwanted, or to whom the constitutional or citizenship benefits or even economic rights of free movement shouldn't be allowed because they were seen as poor, unwanted, vagrant types of categories. There were obviously south to north migrations, black migration from the south to the north of the US. There's the Tom Joad and the Okies type of migration, you know, famous from Grapes of Wrath types of stories. You know, there was a past, in other words, in the US that was about contesting freedom of movement, where historically that has kind of melted away as well. You know, over the years, you know, there are other kinds of discriminations and distinctions within the US, but it's not a distinction about who's really free to move across state borders. I'm kind of suggesting that we need to conceptually think of free movement in those terms. Now, what this, I think, you know, without kind of labouring this point, I mean, what I think this leads to, and why this is particularly interesting in the context of the EU, is that it gets us thinking about other categories of free movements that are pushed onto the road, pushed across borders by capital goods and services. So a lot of the kinds of free movements that are created by globalization or by regional integrations, by, you know, economic dynamics that are creating more and more integrated economic economies, are pushing people across borders, but there are various categories of people moving across borders that are never classified in the migration framework in some sense. So obviously people driving trucks across borders, you know, driving goods, you know, a huge part of the actual daily migration across the US-Mexico border is trucks. You know, it's people moving across the border. It dwarfs any kind of irregular migration that there is. It's a, you know, a much larger component of the cross-border transactions that are going on, and it's somehow categorized in a zone that's not problematic. We have shoppers, we have commuters, we have tourists, we have people who are studying across borders, we have people who are retiring across borders, various sorts of mobile categories that are enabled effectively by some of the free movements of capital goods and services, effectively, I think, kind of are what cause these kinds of movers to get across the borders unproblematically. What I'm suggesting is, in the EU context, the extension of the free movement, the fourth freedom, to the free movement of persons extends, effectively moves the line, the legal category, over the category of workers, of European citizens who have moved across borders, such that they become movers who look much more like the kind of free movers and mobility categories. Workers, in other words, workers who would have otherwise been conceived simply as international migrants or immigrants, are classified differently into free movers across borders who are mobile. Why this is interesting is that I think many of the other factors pushing free movement across borders, certainly shoppers and retirees and students and tourists and so forth, these are actually driven by genuine inequities, in sense, imbalances. You know, it requires resources to be a tourist, it requires resources generally to be a student or be a shopper benefiting from a cheaper country and so forth. And they are, in a sense, part of that unequal world that we see created by the free movement of capital goods and services, so in some sense the neoliberal world. But the workers moving within the European context have this other kind of dimension to it, which is the principle of equity, effectively, that's attached to the contracts that they can enter into as workers on the principle of non-discrimination that is entered into the picture by EU law in this picture. And this is the sort of distinctive novelty here, is that that EU workers, free movers moving across borders as individuals, choosing to move and look for work in another country, have the economic right to be treated without discrimination in the country that they move to, as when they apply for work, but also in the case actually of students as well as another good example. Students have to pay the same amount of fees. That is, discrimination on the basis of nationality drops out of the picture. And when discrimination on the basis of nationality drops out of the picture, we are rolling back one of the fundamental construction points, as it were, of the modern nation state in some sense. What modern nation states have done historically in order to become nation states is draw lines of discrimination between citizens and non-citizens. But this category has been shifted quite radically towards enabling entire categories of economic actors who would otherwise come under, in another system, workers can move, of course, but they have to get a visa, or you have to move. You have to have a job to get to move. If you want to come to the US, yeah, you're in a sense a privileged, educated person is free to move to the US, but they're not really. I mean, I can't get on a plane and move to the US for a job. I have to get a visa. I have to get a job offer. I have to go through various kinds of state-oriented bureaucratic processes in order to be classified as an individual that is allowed in and allowed to have that status in the country. That is simply the stuff that doesn't apply in the European Union. That's the point here. And I think there's a really fundamental shift here in terms of what the state is doing in relation to nationality and in drawing the lines of citizenship and non-citizenship. And this is not derived from some idealistic notion of political equality or Euro citizenship down the line, or a European society in which we're all going to be equal. I'm saying it's actually derived from the market. It's straightforwardly derived from a labour market argument about the equality of contract, effectively, in the labour market for European migrants. Now, what are the consequences of this in empirical terms? Well, I think there are both. I mean, I'm interested in both the formal and the informal properties here. I think there are quite considerable informal potentials for a more market-driven equality within the European space that goes beyond the mere provision of freedom of movement as a non-discrimination principle in law. And I'll get to one principal example of that in a moment. But the other point about this is that I think we begin to see why the free movement of workers within this European context has potentials for a different kind of migration trajectory than we typically associate with immigration. That is, immigration typically, because immigration is always pushed through irregular channels, or it's pushed through visa selective channels, channels that are selected by category and by visa and by various forms in which the national state discriminates between migrants. Migrants always enter at a disadvantage into the labour market of the society that they're moving into. And they basically have to pay their way, either in sort of taking a downward, the typical trajectory of a migrant is a downward move into a lower status job where they basically have to pay the costs of their migration through incurring a kind of penalty on the labour market in terms of their own capital or education, the doctors that end up as taxi drivers. Often migration in a controlled world where the state has this kind of discrimination power leads to migration that is exploitative in certain ways. It leads to the migrants requiring more resources. I mean, it's a typical fact of the most disadvantaged migrants in the world, say moving from certain states in Africa to Europe, typically require a lot of resources to be able to move at all. Even illegally, they have to pay a lot of money, and they often are highly educated, highly motivated, highly able to move, in other words. They have to pay all of those costs in order to be able to get across the borders because the borders are so high in some sense. That leads again to a certain sort of exploitation naturally in the system. Migrants also that are discriminated against already in terms of the receiving state's ability to recognise their as it were, their talents on the labour market, naturally also face exclusions in other senses. So a lot of this gets attached to ethnic and racial and national distinctions that are mapped out geographically in the world. We know a lot about that kind of stuff, of course, from typical migration studies. As well as the exclusion and the exploitation that the migrants face, so these are all negative aspects of international migration, if you like, as we typically see it in the US or Europe, regarding non-European migrants. We also see potentially negative effects on native workers because migrants are cheaper because of the properties they have. They drive down labour market, labour costs. They're competitive with native workers. They can have negative effects on the welfare state because they tend to create informal economies that undermine protected national states. And then on the sending side, they have negative effects in terms of brain drain. So this kind of system, this kind of classic immigration system also sets up all kinds of negative effects in terms of costs of the sending country and losing its most able and mobile populations, which is, of course, again, a familiar tale from immigration. Now, what I want to suggest, and I'll show some examples of this in a moment, of course, is that my argument is really that there are aspects of the recent intra-EU migration, not only conceptually or legally speaking or politically speaking, as I've been doing so far in some sense, but also sociologically speaking, in terms of the actual outcomes on the ground, sociologically, in which intra-EU migration has effectively been a win-win-win type of migration. The free movement within the EU of workers has been beneficial for the migrants who've been able to move freely and earn more money and enter into a productive relationship with the new country. Benefits on the receiving side of European economies actually finding work for these migrants, where there's been complementarity in the kind of work that they've done, where there's been positive forms of entrepreneurship amongst the migrants, creating dynamics within the economy. And also that is beneficial to the sending side. That is, the really kind of, as it were, miraculous part of this is that there are elements, I think, on the evidence that also intra-EU migration actually has had really positive effects also on the sending countries, i.e. the sending countries of East and Central Europe. The ideal case, as you'll see, is the Polish one. So in terms of selection of migrants, the complementarity that they find on the receiving labour market and the kind of circulation effects, that is capital moving back in the other direction, there have been positive effects. Now this is even beyond, this is before we get to the positive effects in other senses of east-west migration in Europe, which are mainly geopolitical. Mainly it's been about the resoldering of Europe, the bringing in of East and Central Europe into, solidly into the heartland of Europe again, so that there's no more distinctions. Obviously, with issues to do with relationships to Russia, kind of very much still on the agenda, as well as the more high-flying theoretical claims that people have attached to this, which is usually to do with cosmopolitanism and post-national membership and other kinds of ideas of citizenship beyond the nation state. So I think implicitly a lot of those things have been advanced as well, but there is a kind of basic economic core to all of this stuff. And I think it's led to a kind of radical Europeanization of territory and population in some sense in Europe. There's really some interesting thing. Now, it doesn't remove other disadvantages. It doesn't suddenly, we haven't got a flat playing field in Europe. This is not the flat world argument transferred into European context. What I would argue empirically is that it has had benefits well beyond any kind of conception of it only benefiting the European elites. It's tended to move down through society. It's tended to be European middle classes that have seen their lives most qualitatively change as a result of free movement opportunities within Europe. But I think it's also transformed workers' lives, and it's also transforming the lives of, in different ways, workers in rich and poor states have both benefited. I mean, a lot of it's to do with, people in rich states get to have their retirement homes or their holidays in the south of Europe, and people in the poorer states do get opportunities to consider working within the European labour market rather than being constrained to their national context. This is kind of a long theoretical preliminary, but I hope that I'm kind of emphasising some key points theoretically that shift our views of European free movement. Now I want to address now, of course, a bit of evidence or a bit of kind of examples, as it were, of this, and looking at the Eurocities in the so-called global era. And I think it's quite important to bracket this as a phenomenon of the 1990s and 2000s up to 2008 to look at what happens after 2008. But I want to also address this issue about Britain. So this is the second point I wanted to raise. Britain as the outlying neoliberal renegade economy of the of Europe, the heartland of Europe. It's typically constructed. I think a lot of this is a kind of problem that follows from the varieties of capitalism literature that tends to sort of not the original work necessarily on varieties of capitalism, which is rather subtle in many ways, but the kinds of conceptions it then leads to, the kind of comparative conceptions we have of worlds of capitalism in Europe, and how the British is it's the Anglo-Saxon, the Anglo-American version. As you might guess, I detest this adjective Anglo-Saxon. I think it's absolutely meaningless in this context. For all kinds of reasons, partly because, as I would argue, Britain has dealt with the issue of migration much better than any other European member state. It's the country that has embraced freedom of movement. It's the most highly Europeanized member state on this one measurement, that is the measurement of openness to European citizens to work in the national economy. It's the most open. It's one of the highest integrated countries in terms of the willingness of Britons to go abroad and benefit from European integration. They just don't get it politically. I mean, conceptually, the British are schizophrenic on this kind of issue. They're doing Europe, they're not believing in Europe in many ways. It's also, needless to say, Britain is also a welfare state. It's still a welfare state. Certainly the part of Britain I spend time in West Yorkshire, the north of England, is very much a welfare state in terms of the way it operates. There's public services and all that kind of stuff, at least in comparison, say, to Spain and Italy, or something like this. So there are other aspects about why Britain shouldn't be just simply put into the neoliberal box, albeit the fact that, particularly the Labour government, I think, of Blair, in the late 90s and 2000s, really did push all kinds of genuine neoliberal ideas in terms of the way in which they organised politics. But there were other things going on. It wasn't only neoliberalism. And it wasn't neoliberalism really in the way in which it opens up towards freedom of movement of workers. Now all of this is crucial. I'm going to sort of start off with the negative stuff in a sense before I talk a bit about the positive stuff. Because coming up in Europe there's a vote on membership. And the vote on membership of the EU, if it happens after the next election, will very much turn on the issue of EU migrants in the British economy. That is, UKIP basically, the United Kingdom Independence Party, has basically mobilised the idea that Britain has made a huge mistake in opening its borders to European migrants. It's not an argument about old migrants, post-colonial migrants. There are even prominent black and Asian members of UKIP who are part of the debating teams, as it were, arguing this case. It's about Poles and Romanians. It's about white Europeans. It's a xenophobia applied to Europeans that is politicising the anti-EU vote. And one of the most obvious consequences of EU membership for British people is the visible transformation of their society by European migrants, effectively, in the last 10 to 15 years. This is also part of the argument about super diversity, which I think is worth looking into, the Steve Vertevent arguments about the transformation of Britain, migration in Britain. Now, Cameron's response to this obviously has been not only to put the EU up for grabs in terms of a vote on membership potentially, but also to propose at the end of last year that, as he says, quote unquote, free movement should be less free. What Cameron wants is to restrict access of certain categories of European migrants to the so-called benefit tourism that they're supposedly engaging in. Putting migrants through a much longer waiting test, putting them through various sorts of proofs of residency and, as it were, integration in Europe, that is, moving them back towards the kinds of things that apply to non-European migrants in the British case. Creating caps on migration for European migrants. There are already caps. In the last 2 or 3 years, various caps have been put on other kinds of international migrants within the European within the British economy, such that, for example, very highly skilled, I think this would also possibly apply to Americans or others. There may be, we'd have to look to see whether there are ways around this for certain more privileged categories, but certainly some sorts of intermediate categories, people coming from Asia or from Turkey or from Latin America would now be subject to migration caps in terms of sheer numbers that are allowed in. So there was a kind of global openness as well attached to the free movement ideas within Britain during its boom years. And also, so caps on migrants, caps on European migrants, again possibly applying. We don't know where this ends. Is it just if you're Balkan, or is it does it also apply to Poles? Does it also apply to Hungarians? Does it also apply to Spanish or Greeks? Or where do we draw the line? Maybe we should start with the French, because they're the ones that are actually the most numerous. Actually not the most numerous, but amongst West Europeans, the most numerous. And potentially putting in a visa regime. So the idea of, literally this is on the table. Let's reintroduce a visa regime where we actually set up visa offices, maybe in Romania, and actually interview people and put them through visas before they can actually get access to the British economy. So, trying to carve into the free movement concept as it's been extended all the way to all of the member states. I think obviously they have in mind the Romanians, also the Baltic states, which have provided a lot of migrants to Britain recently, so Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and so forth. Possibly other kind, it would all be, like as always, for example in the US, it would depend on international relations with particular countries. You can imagine the kind of, pick and choose type of scenario, perhaps. Perhaps that's what they have in mind. Now, needless to say, I don't think there's anything liberal about what Cameron is proposing. This is not liberalism from a liberal point of view, nor is it neoliberalism. Let's face it, this is not about opening borders towards the flows of economic good sense, in a sense of free movement of capital, goods, services, goods and persons. This is about reimposing national state protectionism on a labour market, which may have benefits for British workers, as is being argued for by some of the advocates on the left of these kinds of restrictions. It may please the voters, it may, in other words, please democratic citizens, as it's pleasing, as is the case recently in Switzerland, which has recently voted to try and opt out of free movement and therefore the Schengen Agreement, which is part of a referendum, which the Swiss have absolutely no idea how they're going to implement this, but the government now is under pressure to actually carve into the free movement concept, which Switzerland also opted into. It's a national rebordering of Europe, and of course the interesting part is where the borders get lined. Do they have anything to do with Europe at all, or is it somehow a British piecemeal British international relations in the old-fashioned way with, we don't like the Romanians, but we'll take the Poles because we like them or something. Possibly cutting across the Southerners as well. Anti-free movement. Well, again, without wanting to sound too Hayekian on this, this is raising sort of uncomfortable issues, as I said, for migration theory. Really, there really was a self-regulating system of free movement in Europe, and the British vote potentially is cutting across it. All of the benefits, the virtues of that system, as we might detail, are immediately destroyed. Once you set up restrictive categories, visas, new kinds of borders, you remove all of the kind of market-driven dynamics that were actually leading to rather different results in the period up to 2008. You move back to smoke and mirrors, you move back to the hypocrisy of the American immigration system, which is we need migrants, we have open borders de facto, but on the other hand we have to have incredibly symbolic control and security effects all the time in order to sort of punitively distinguishing between migrants on very arbitrary kind of international relations basis. We need the workers in the fields, we need them as a secondary labour force, we need them provisional and cheap to employ, etc. But we also need to be deporting and controlling and building walls and so forth. This is kind of inherently exploitative and excluding smoke and mirrors type of thing, the kind of thing that the European experiment with freedom of movement was suggesting others. And the UKIP position, the British position, the Conservative position on this, is flying in the face of rationality, effectively. It's flying in the face of the evidence of what actually happened during the good years, as it were, and which, are still, in some senses, particularly in London and the southeast, there hasn't been much trace of the kinds of really dramatic negative effects of the economy that we're seeing in some other parts of Europe and other parts of Britain. So, now, I'm not going to go through all of the details here without we want to get to a discussion, but the basic story about London during the high period of internal migration into Europe is that it became a kind of New York City for Europe. It became the European New York City, and it was the capital of Europe in an economic sense. It was not only was it the capital in terms of the money, but it was the capital in terms of populations. The free movement system, as Britain has been able to benefit from, set up extraordinary dynamics in terms of, from the receiving side, the selection potential of the migrants. London, obviously, like New York, is a hugely young city, so vast numbers, a vast proportion of the migrants attracted into the London economy are young. They're young and they're educated. Get some of the ideas: 92% foreigners under 35, 55% between 18 and 24. A massive concentration of the foreign population in the city, a hugely wealthy and productive area, and you get an enormous attraction pull, a magnet pull, which really is a kind of pulling off the highly educated from France, from Germany, from Denmark, from Spain, from Italy, and then eventually from Eastern and Central Europe as well. We think of the Poles and the Romanians as completely different kinds of migrants, but in fact, those migrants were also the highly educated and the highly skilled. And if they weren't in the high educated category, they were in the high skilled category in terms of the kinds of economic activities that they move into. And so you get this sort of system in a sense emerging. They're better qualified than the British. They tend to move into lower paid jobs, but then hit the ground and move up. So they have this kind of very, very beneficial social mobility type of dynamic. So they're downwardly mobile, but then move up very quickly. They're largely invisible. There are not really ethnic and racial issues around them at this point in time. And then there are the other kinds of benefits with the British kind of offshore relationship with the rest of Europe. A lot of the social dumping is done outside, a lot of the education is done outside. Migrants, and this is the kind of qualitative stuff that I get into in my book and so forth. Their healthcare is located back home. They're taking their dirty washing back home at the weekends. They're flying back and forth. They've got their social security long term in their homeland countries. They don't stay beyond the long term. There's a large proportion of them not staying. A high transience and a high mobility, a high return kind of migration. It's a very beneficial dynamism from this point of this side of thing, and in this sense, I mean, when you're thinking about the French relationship with this really is a winning-losing kind of situation. I mean, basically France does disastrously badly during this period in terms of losing lots of its best young people to London. London becomes a much more dynamic city. It really starts to dominate internationally, and it's all sealed eventually in the symbolism of the Olympics going to London at the last minute over Paris, is of course the payoff of this. And this is the kind of this is a sort of pure liberal economics from the Financial Times. You see the similar sorts of arguments, sort of crowing really about the success of the London case. I tell a very different story about what happens with older migrants, and the longer term consequences of all this are not so rosy, but from an economic point of view, there's no doubt that Britain benefited hugely from these migrants. Now, West European migrants generally rather invisible, quite significant numbers, but they're just there and they're still there. London is still very much the Euro capital of choice for young Europeans wanting to move into creative, dynamic economic sectors, or get an education, or move into the global world, or whatever it is. London is the place to go to. But I think they matter all the more for the effects on East and Central European migrations during this period. So the four freedoms are extended through the accessions. Britain brings down the barriers immediately for the A8, there's the 8 members that joined in 2004, and this has a huge effect immediately on Polish and Lithuanian and other migrants coming to the British economy. the transitional barriers are completely down, whereas they're maintained across most of the other European countries. And so the kinds of selection effects that happen in Germany or in France are, of course, very different to the British kind of effects. Britain gets the good migrants, or the beneficial migrants, the ones that can actually benefit the economy. These other countries end up with a different kind of migration system as a result of their particular choices. Germany gets just as many migrants, but it doesn't open the accession clause, so it gets them in a kind of irregular way and in a secondary market kind of way, so it maintains a kind of smoke and mirrors type of policy in a sense. It's not the same form of managed migration. I've already mentioned why EU enlargement was important from geopolitical points of view. There are also other kinds of important demographic and economic arguments. All of these things were positive, and the one thing that isn't positive, of course, is political reaction. I mean, selling this to the electorate is the hard part. But for a certain period of time in Britain, there's a kind of suspension of disbelief. I mean, it's not true that the British simply become hostile to the Polish from day one. Rather, it has a real transformative effect on the British economy and British society. They start to appear in all kinds of sectors and all kinds of places in Britain in a way that no other recent international migration in Britain has ever gone into the provinces or small towns, whereas East European migration really has. It's generalised within Europe, and they start to become an interesting potential ideal case in the sense that it's also hitched, I think, quite considerably to positive economic growth dynamics in Poland as well, and certain sort of positive aspects. So this is just a throwaway slide, but you kind of get the idea. This is cheap airlines. So one of the benefits of European integration, deregulated airlines. What do deregulated airlines do? They respond to market demand. Market demand creates a huge amount of transactions going on between Poland. This is people flying back and forth. This is not a pattern associated with settlement migration or immigration to become a British citizen. This is transnational migration within Europe, effectively, happening. You'll know the French. You've probably seen this 100 times before, but this was the Polish response to the French vote. Because the French voted against European integration, Constitution 2005, largely on this issue. I mean, largely on the issue of extending deregulation of the labour market so that there wouldn't be these kinds of barriers towards certain sorts of workers in the economy, the so-called Bolkestein Directive and so forth. It was supposedly going to liberalise the French economy, for better or worse. I mean, that would have negative effects for certain sorts of social protections for workers, but it would have had good effects potentially on the hugely sclerotic French economy. The one thing they didn't want was the Polish plumbers, and so the Polish plumbers didn't go to France, they went to Britain, but there was a huge panic about Polish plumbers, and despite the Polish relations with France historically, in terms of immigration and so forth, there was this stance, and of course the Polish thought it was ridiculous. Just briefly, there are other interesting effects of this. I mean, it doesn't actually limit itself only to the European member states. Europe, over this same period, the 1990s, 2000s, entering into all kinds of new sorts of association and economic agreements with border states to the EU, potentially North Africa, but certainly towards the east, certainly Turkey. And entering into relations with these countries, yes, there was often a big border control clause attached to this. They were really trying to restrict transit migration and other forms of so-called unwanted migration through these borders, but it's also creating a new kind of regulated border where potentially new kinds of categories of economic migration become possible across these borders. And it's particularly interesting, I think, in the case of Turkey, where yes, Turks face all kinds of ordinary immigration barriers and restrictions in terms of movements and visas, and this has got certainly worse in the last 5 years or so. And yet we have within Europe a rather interesting transnational mobility system of Turks rather routinely moving between Germany and Central Europe, or Denmark, Sweden and Turkey, often through business categories, often through visa-free travel of certain kinds. Students, obviously, highly educated, a lot more Turkish migration going on within Europe that I think is very much linked to the potentials of European integration, kind of having their effects on borders beyond the case, and beyond the case of members only. And so, you know, a lot of the story we typically hear is about closing of borders externally, but there is also an opening of borders. Okay, I want to finish with a brief sort of set of statements about the conclusion as regards, you know, the debate with Wolfgang Streeck, as it were. And I put up 2 slides here which remind us of Polanyi's interest in free movement and migration in the 19th century, and double movement that he predicted or historically reads from this earlier era of neoliberalism, as it were, during the 19th century. Industrialization, the movement of migrants from the countryside to cities was an economic earthquake. It transformed within half a century vast masses of the inhabitants of the countryside from settled folk to shiftless migrants, but also, of course, massively industrialized and modernized and changed and transformed all of the countries that experienced this, including, of course, turning peasants into citizens and peasants into, you know, modern individuals along the way. But that was what was happening. That was put on the road, as it were, by economic and structural changes. And yet, while on the one hand markets spread all over the face of the globe, on the other we had a deep-seated movement springing into being to resist the pernicious effects of the market-controlled economy, society protecting itself against the perils inherent in a self-regulating market system, the one comprehensive feature in the history of the age. Now, a lot of the current debate on neoliberalism is evoking Polanyi in this kind of thought in mind, in a sense, to castigate, in a sense, the separation of the market from politics and society, and the kind of reaction against the self-regulating market. I think there's an important debate to be had about reading Polanyi, which I think is not about reading Polanyi in a Marxist way, but rather understanding that Polanyi is really about the relationship of the market and politics as embedded in one another, rather than it just being the market embedded in politics, as it's typically understood. That is, there are market relations in society, and we need to kind of take account of what market relations are, and just, in some sense, see this as a double-sided kind of issue rather than a one-way type of argument. But what you're going to hear, I think, from Wolfgang Streeck, which I think is very much de rigueur and very much on the agenda as regards interpreting Europe today, is that basically the argument is we have the wrong Europe. We have a Europe that's become neoliberal, that prioritises the free movement of capital goods, services, and, well, persons is there but not really looked at very closely. It's just another factor of mobility like all of the others. What this is doing is concentrating profits and resources in the big corporations that are able to kind of escape from the boundaries of nation states, concentrating effects on elites, internationally, global elites and others who are able to benefit from this, destroying labour market protection and driving down standards for workers, pushing growing inequalities across European states just as it is internationally. And of course a big part of this argument is not only that it's the state rolling back this stuff in favour of the self-regulating market, but rather it's the state rolling out this stuff. That the state is implied in constructing this particular kind of market fundamentalism that's creating this kind of world that we're living in. And Streeck, as Colin Kraut and as many others, working in this kind of varieties of capitalism type of mode, basically calls out to a kind of popular reaction against this. And I see this as quite Marxisant, even if it's not Marxist. It's very much still believing in some sort of potential reaction of the people in some sense against this. And this will be the Polanyi reaction, in which society springs up and suddenly kind of revolts against all of this through what Streeck sees as a potential democratic voice. There has to be democracy to curb the effects of the market, in other words. And this is, in some sense, the other Europe that we've lost along the way. And I think Streeck is very not very optimistic about the potential of a European solution to this. And I think he sees really a return to the solidities of the nation state in some sense, Another version, Esping Anderson, it's the return. We need to conceive of European economies as an idealised version of the Danish model, effectively, where we have high-paid services, childcare for middle classes, and a protected economy in some sense, with high levels of regulation and so forth. And this will somehow be delivered by democracy. Well, I think I think the problem here is that democracy on all of these issues means the end of migration within Europe of the kind that I've been talking about. It will vote against free movement, it will vote against intra-EU migration, because it will be seen as inherently problematic for exactly these sorts of issues, for protections of workers, for the priority of national citizens over foreigners within the European space. This is what the Swiss vote was about, this is what the UKIP agenda is in Europe, and I think it's the threat, in a sense, of austerity is that we get pushed back into this kind of Europe, in which effectively we move back towards national democracies, national social democracies, perhaps, if we're lucky. But not a Europe in which any of the potential transformative effects that I've been trying to describe through free movement come into being. Now, the point about times of austerity is that, of course, free movement should become even more crucial. This is precisely the moment at which we may be able to see rather more effective ways of burden sharing across Europe that might be achieved through something other than state-driven redistributions. I mean, we can try and redistribute the resources from Germany to Greece, but it's a difficult way of sharing the burden when there are other kinds of channels potential through migration, I think. This is, I think, effectively what is happening with young Greeks, young Spanish, young Italians, and so forth. As with other kinds of categories of migrants that have seen the potentials of free movement within Europe, they will move within Europe as long as they're able to move within Europe. And they may well continue to enter into the kinds of circular and transnational kinds of patterns within Europe as long as the free movement is open. As soon as you start closing the borders or making it difficult, free movement turns into migration, and migration turns into settlement and brain drain, effectively. And that's also, I think, the other side of this. On the other hand, the democratic vote in Switzerland and the UK, and if this gets extended across Europe, will lead to, well, a Europe of potentially of less free movement, as Cameron wants, a Europe perhaps of new sorts of borders or categories that restrict migration in certain ways, a Europe potentially of visas again. I mean, maybe we can go back to some kind of international relations regime in a realist sense in which the nation state is trying, reasserts its sovereignty over borders against the integrated European space that has been created. And I think there are real threats of new lines being drawn through Europe on these lines. I mean, we heard from Marion Foucault a couple of weeks back about the effects on economic categories. The brunt of these distinctions are borne by people, and they're borne by people when they experience mobility within the space, and they're starting to feel those new categories being reimposed by society, the double movement perhaps, if not yet in law and politics officially. We still have free movement, but people are starting to get a lot less tolerant on the ground. Invisible free movers from Southern Europe or Eastern Europe will start to become visible immigrants again. We're starting to see the old lines of West and East, North and South re-emerging. Poles kind of got away from this up to a point. Polish always did experience these things. They still experienced distinctions, but they still were sensitive. They were also experiencing, in some sense, the benefits of becoming invisible, of moving across a line. Romanians never did. I mean, in fact, sociologically, they always felt discriminated against and ethnically and racially kind of categorised, despite being perhaps free movers at certain points. But this will surely become as a big shock to the Greeks, the Portuguese, the Italians, the Spanish, and the French maybe, when people in Britain start to see them as unwanted immigrants and not Europeans, fellow Europeans living within Europe and in a European space. And as a last line, I think this is really the undoing of what the undoing of European integration and the European Union if this is the direction we're going in.